So, friends, Donald Trump's lawlessness in the way he's using the United States military is endangering our military members, our troops. And Trump's unlawful killing of human beings in international waters is creating a situation where the U.S. military is at war, at least figuratively speaking, with itself. I just sat down to discuss this topic with law professor and military law expert Dan Maurer, who authored an important new piece titled Fighting on Three Fronts: The U.S. Military's War with Itself. So, friends, I hope you enjoy this conversation with law professor and retired Army JAG Lieutenant Colonel Dan Maurer. Welcome, everybody. We have our friend Dan Maurer back, law professor, military law expert, international law expert, retired Army JAG Lieutenant Colonel. Not only is he currently teaching law, he has taught both constitutional law and criminal law at West Point. He has also been a teacher and instructor at the Army's JAG School on the campus of the University of Virginia. He's becoming somewhat of a frequent guest here because of his expertise and his clarity when he's explaining all of these issues that are of searing importance to not only our military members, but I think to all of us, given, Donald Trump's abuse of the military as I see it. But Dan, thank you for being willing to come back early and often and enlighten us about these issues.
No, thanks, Glenn. Glad to be here. Actually, not glad to be here. I'd frankly prefer a situation where we didn't have to talk about any of this, mostly bad news, all the time. But I do appreciate the venue and the opportunity to share a little bit about what's going on from a military/legal perspective. So much is in the news about the military these days, and much of it is either confusing or misleading. So I'm glad I have the chance to talk about it.
Confusing, misleading, and unfortunately, I think dangerous for our military members, not to mention the civilians, in the cities where our military members might be deployed. This really is a lose-lose proposition. So let me start with the title of your new piece on Substack, and it's Fighting on Three Fronts: The U.S. Military's War with Itself. And when I saw that, my heart sunk a little bit. It's a provocative yet accurate title, but just the notion of the military being at war with itself is so disheartening. But why don't you? I don't want to steal the thunder. If you can go ahead and kind of tick through, at least let's start with the first two fronts as you see them, and then we'll get into it on what the third front is that the military is fighting presently.
Sure. So the first front, really, these can go in either order. One front is the use of the military, both the National Guard and the active duty troops, potentially active duty troops, in domestic operations. First in Los Angeles, then potentially in Oregon, potentially in Chicago, in District of Columbia, with various threats for various other places too. And the idea for that was just deploy the military to back up essentially and secure ICE as they conduct their very controversial and objectively very aggressive campaign in support of the president's policy agenda to make immigration a national security issue and to show as much force as possible. The idea was these events are generating protests, and those protests are getting violent, and the violence is somehow impeding ICE in conducting its operations or putting ICE agents at risk or putting federal property at risk, and therefore let's deploy the National Guard. And he's done that, attempted three times, and in all three occasions, the courts have pushed back for various reasons. Nothing is finalized yet. All these cases are still kind of percolating through the appellate process, but the bottom line is there is a contentious use of the domestic military to deploy into American cities when there's no rebellion, there's no invasion, there's no insurrection. We can't forget the fact that he has not invoked the Insurrection Act, which he could do, which would which would allow the military to go into places like LA and Chicago and Portland to enforce the law. He has not done that, which means the military is very, very restricted. But all that means is that the military is now put in these somewhat novel situations where they are acting like police in that they are protecting other agents doing their job. They are establishing roadblocks. They're setting up perimeters. Frankly, they're doing a lot of things that they might have done in some sense in Iraq or Afghanistan in support of combat operations. But what's going on in LA and Portland and Chicago are not combat operations. They are domestic law enforcement operations. And the Posse Comitatus Act is a well-known act now, getting much more attention, that bars the military from being used in this way unless there's an express statutory authority to do that, like the Insurrection Act. So all this is being litigated in courts right now, and it presents the military with this new environment, a new operating environment in which they are doing things that they are not necessarily trained well to do, or trained at all to do. When they're deployed to these cities, they're given a little bit of training. If they're National Guard, they may have been trained already in some basic riot control operations, but they are not, for the most part, trained and taught on how to observe constitutional rights of fellow Americans when they're conducting operations. When they deploy overseas, they're following rules of engagement that are ultimately based on the laws of armed conflict, and they're much more permissive than our Constitution is. So they're operating on under a whole new layer of constraints they're not used to. And that can be confusing. And if they're not taught well or not trained well, or if there are no JAGs there to kind of facilitate commanders instructing their troops on how to appropriately use force, then bad things could very well happen. So they're fighting this domestic front. And it's unusual, it's uncomfortable. For example, two National Guard soldiers, one a captain. I believe we talked about this last time, Glenn. One a captain, one an NCO, publicly said, we would not follow an order to deploy into Chicago. It's that level of content. We don't normally see that kind of, foreshadowing of disobedience. So that's interesting in and of itself, but deeply indicative of a larger problem. So that's front number one.
So before we move on to front number two, I think we can safely say that the Trump administration has been losing in the courts for the most part, not unanimously. There have been a smattering of rulings in the administration's favor, but they're largely losing in multiple federal jurisdictions. But I think as of right now, we haven't yet had any action from the Supreme Court, which I think is what we are all awaiting, to sort of see what the Supreme Court is going to do, that will then go on to be applied nationwide. But in the courts, when we see federal judges say things like the Trump administration's assertions about what's going on in the streets of American cities are, quote, untethered to the facts. When we see federal judges say things like, the Trump administration is adding fuel to a fire it started, and then my addition would be kind of using the chaos it created as an excuse to try to militarize the streets. It's pretty clear that they're losing, and they're losing consistently in court. But we have to wait to see what the Supreme Court does. And I don't even know that it's fruitful for us to speculate about this until we actually have a case that is decided by them.
Yeah, that's right. Like I said, it's percolating at various different levels, and ultimately what the court's going to have to decide is the amount of discretion that courts lower than the Supreme Court will give to the president when the president makes a decision about using force domestically. Already they get lots of deference when they deploy forces overseas, but does that same logic apply domestically? So that's one issue. And fundamental to that is what happens when the president is essentially making up facts to justify this use of force. Can we rely on that statement and just simply say, well, we'll defer to that statement, even though we know it's not factually grounded? So that's the big issue, and I hope we get some Supreme Court resolution soon, and I hope it works in favor of the rule of law, not rule of man.
Yeah. So let's move on to the second front on which the military is fighting.
Yeah. So second front is getting a lot more news lately, and that is use of force in the Caribbean and in the Pacific now, in the Eastern Pacific, outside Mexico. So ostensibly, there are drug running boats, vessels, small fast boats that are transporting illicit narcotics from places like Venezuela to other places in the Caribbean, where they are then being transported eventually into the U.S. For sale. The administration has characterized these groups like Tren de Aragua and other cartels and other transnational groups as narco terrorists. One that the non-legal term narco terrorist is then designated as foreign terrorist organizations. The State Department has the authority under law to do that. But designating something a foreign terrorist organization doesn't give anybody lethal authority to do anything. It simply means there are financial consequences. You block their accounts essentially, to restrict the flow of money that they're getting through the banking system. That's all that means. It does not mean they're now targetable as if they're Al Qaeda or ISIS. But that's exactly how they're being characterized. These non-state armed groups that pose a threat to the U.S. persons, and that's it. The drug flow into the United States is a reason to go to war with them because they pose this imminent threat to our security. So it's a self-defense argument. And so they're blowing up these boats. I believe the number is up to 21 now. Over 80 people killed. In public reporting, at least some of those are reported to not be members of any drug cartel or organization whatsoever, just simply fishermen. These drug boats are being attacked by drones, it seems like, launched from what appear to be U.S. warships in the South Caribbean. And whether it escalates into a larger conflict with Venezuela, and that is apparently on the table, being discussed by the president and others, to more directly interdict the drug flow. That still remains to be seen, and I hope that doesn't come to that, because that's not a reason to go to war. It's a reason to put people in jail, but not a reason to go to war. So the military is now fighting the second front, where they're doing kind of traditional things, and that they're dropping bombs and firing missiles at people. But what's not traditional about it is that the targets are not lawful targets. They're not members of organized armed groups. Legal term of art in a international armed conflict means something legally, and drug cartels are not those groups. Never have been. No state has ever argued that they are. And even if they're not members of armed groups, they're not what's called directly participating in hostilities. It's another legal term of art that means if you are directly participating in hostilities, you become targetable. You lose your protections under the Geneva Conventions from being attacked by the military. But the problem is drug running, even by armed cartel members, is never been considered direct participation in hostilities, which means legally the only category that these people fall into is civilian non-combatant. Criminal civilian non-combatant, but civilian non-combatant. And under international law, you can't kill them. It's called murder. Under domestic law, you can't kill them. It's called murder. Bottom line, we are violating both domestic law and international law when we take each and every one of these strikes. So that's the second tangible front that the U.S. military is fighting.
And so let me follow up on that, because as horrific as the first front is, the military being potentially unlawfully and unconstitutionally deployed to the streets of American cities and towns, and as deadly and horrific as these lawless strikes in international waters are, and I think at latest count, the Trump administration has unlawfully murdered, executed 76 human beings. I think that's the most recent tally, unfortunately. Let me just read a little bit of the third front as you write about it in this Substack piece, which I highly recommend to everybody. You say the combatant on the third front is the military's conscience, which is being torn by the commander in chief between two polarizing sets of duties. It's a fraying rope being stretched in a game of tug of war between the president pulling on one end and the military's duty to support and defend the Constitution pulling on the other. In some ways, not to downplay the danger of the first two fronts, the game that Donald Trump is playing with the military and the pressure and the stress he's putting on the military is perhaps the most potentially dangerous and damaging, not just to the military, and this is going to sound hyperbolic, but really to the viability of our democracy moving forward. So talk a little bit about your characterization of the military fighting on this third front, which is the military fighting with itself.
Yeah, yeah. This has bothered me for, well, as long as we've been doing this, because I see on one hand a desire to, be obedient, to follow the commander in chief, to perform that set of duties that they've always done, and to avoid looking like they're rejecting it. Because if they look like they're rejecting it, then it looks like they're partisan, and we want an apolitical, nonpartisan military. So they have to walk a fine line. But on the other hand, they also know that what they've been asked to do domestically is very much a gray area and probably unlawful in many respects. At least that's what the courts are beginning to say. And it puts them in a difficult position of saying, you want us, we're required to follow your lawful orders, but what you're asking us to do is unlawful. How do we respond to that professionally? And then with regard to the strikes, the way the military law works is that orders are presumed to be lawful. Otherwise, you're putting troops in harm's way all the time, and you're asking them to do things that are superhuman in a sense, and putting their own instinct for protection and survival away to potentially sacrifice themselves for their greater good. That requires drilling into them the necessity of following orders. So orders are presumed to be lawful, and there are certain things, however, that are patently unlawful, like an order to take a prisoner out back behind the shed and execute them. That would be a patently unlawful order. An order to kill somebody, commit a crime, would be patently unlawful, and you're allowed to disobey from that. You can disobey that order, and when you disobey it, you're not violating another Uniform Code of Military Justice article, which is called obedience to orders. So you're not committing a crime when you disobey it, if it's patently unlawful. But with these strikes, from the drone operator to maybe some more mid-level commanders in the chain, it may not be patently unlawful for them to strike. They've been told by the president and secretary of defense that he has the authority to do this domestically. He's called it a non-international armed conflict, that we're following the laws of armed conflict when we do these strikes. So for all intents and purposes, it's like they have top cover. Like they're told, I'm allowed to do this. Who am I to question it? My concern is there's more senior commanders who do know enough about the law of war because JAGs teach them, and their operational experience for the last 2 decades in Iraq and have drilled into them the necessity and the practical benefits of following the laws of armed conflict. And part of that is identifying civilians and combatants, distinguishing between civilians and combatants. That is a fundamental task that commanders are responsible for doing. And to me, as a former military lawyer, it's obvious to me that they are civilians, that these are non-combatant civilians on these boats. As dangerous as they may be, as criminal as they may be, they are not targetable with the military. But there is an argument being made by the Office of Legal Counsel at DOJ that is somehow, we have not seen this yet, hasn't been published, which is odd itself. But that memo purports to explain that service members are not at legal risk. They're not violating any laws when they do this. The commander in chief has the ability to do all this. That acts as a kind of umbrella shield as well, arguably, for these commanders who say, well, it's kind of a gray area. I kind of feel not so great about it, but the president is telling me to do it. And the highest levels of lawyers in the federal government are telling me that it's okay. So again, who am I to question this? But what's interesting is, and I think this is a manifestation of that tension of the rope fraying, is the Southcom commander, the 4-star admiral who was in charge of Southern Command, which has the operational authority over the Caribbean, is retiring early. And it's reported that he had reservations about the legality of this operation. He asked questions about it, and it seems either he was asked to retire, or it was indicated that would be in his best interest to do so, or he faced silence or outright rejection and said, "This is not the military that I joined. I can't abide that. I can't stay in a military that refuses to follow the rule of law, and I'm not going to be putting my signature on things that continue that complete disavowal of law." So that tells me that there is a tension, that there is concern. Other reporting has demonstrated that there are lower level lawyers that are also questioning the legality of this. I don't know if that will have a long-term impact or not. The long-term impact that I'm concerned about is the fact that the military is even in these positions at all, where it has to make a decision. Do I follow this somewhat lawful order? Do I question it? Or do I risk looking partisan if I do so? Is that more of a long-term damage to the military than following the order and killing bad guys? Which wrong is worse? And they should never be in that position. The commander in chief should never put them in that position where they have to question their own professionalism to execute a lawful order. That should never be the case. And right now it seems like on two different fronts they are forced to confront that very big problem. And that's what I mean by kind of the soul of the military is being attacked. They have to question the degree to which they are willing to put their stars on the table, so to speak, and resign if necessary. This is not simply is it better to waterboard terrorists or not waterboard terrorists? Is that technically the meaning of torture, or is it not? Is it wise to invade Iraq with the weapons of mass destruction evidence that we have or don't have, or not? Those are large-scale strategic questions that are really hard, and the legality of it is hard. The legality here is not so hard. I think it's plainly illegal, but they're being told by their superiors that it is legal, and that's a fundamental source of that tension.
And to me, I was an Army JAG, 6.5 years active duty. And then I shifted over to the Department of Justice for decades, and I handled murder cases in DC. The way I look at this, it's inarguably illegal, and it would be no different than if law enforcement, National Guards, or federal troops walked up to a drug dealer or a drug runner, on dry land in the United States and executed them. This, to me, is indistinguishable what we are doing to alleged drug runners, drug dealers in international waters. I think part of the problem, you say no commander in chief should ever put military members in this situation. Yet we have not only a commander in chief, but we have a secretary of defense who says things like JAGs are obstacles to the command, to what we want to accomplish. And he says things like, we need to engage in maximum lethality. I think I would add with minimum legality, apparently, or perhaps no legality at all. So my question, and maybe we can finish up with this, Dan, is what are military members to do?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's hard to say. I think at a minimum, they should be exercising their professional judgment and know that they are not automatons. They are professionals, whether they're a private E1 or a 4-star admiral or general. They are not goose-stepping Nazi automatons that just follow orders because they're told to follow orders. They have some agency, and they should be questioning, and the commanders should be providing top cover to those that do question. And those commanders should be questioning all the way up the chain of command until it gets so annoying, so frustrating that the president and the secretary of defense must give plausible, realistic facts that justify lawful use of force. And if they can't, then those officers, those commanders should be saying, I will not follow an unlawful order. I believe that's unlawful. And then if they get ignored, then they resign, right? And maybe they risk prosecution, maybe not, but that's the signal that we are a nonpartisan military, or have a nonpartisan military, and we follow lawful orders. Those are the two big fundamental things at stake here: a nonpartisan military that appears to be nonpartisan, and one that follows the rule of law always, not just when it's convenient. So, interestingly, to one of your earlier points, and shameless self plug, there is an article coming out in Just Security here today or tomorrow, most likely, that presents a hypothetical legal review of the boat strikes. I wrote it. It's presented as if with some colleagues of mine from a former JAG working group who reviewed it for me. But it's a hypothetical, as if the JAG colonel at Southern Command had reservations about these proposed boat strikes and raised them up to the commander. What would that legal review look like, and what would the objection be? And it's meant to fill the space until we have an OLC opinion that purports to explain it. But I'll jump to the bottom line. The opinion says it's unlawful, and it advises the commander, the hypothetical commander, about what to do next. So if you're interested in this subject, then I encourage you to take a look at it. It'll be on Just Security, that website, here in the next day or so.
And I will link that for everybody on Substack and across the other platforms I'm on. And so this is the obligatory question at the end of every one of these sessions we have. Where can people find you? How can they plug into your content?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I have a Substack called Politics by Other Means. You can just look for that, or look for Dan Maurer. I'm also on LinkedIn. Those are my two big venues. Not so much on X or Twitter or Blue Sky, but those are primary. My Substack page and on LinkedIn.
Great.